Well, hello everybody, and welcome to this Fane online event, a night in with Bernard Cornwell. I myself would prefer a night out with Bernard Cornwell, but these are the times and we've got to deal with them. Hello to everybody who's watching live tonight. Hello to everybody in the future, as it is now, watching this over the course of the next 48 hours. But hello most of all to Bernard Cornwell, a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him a short introduction anyway. He's written more books than I can count. I tried. I think it's over 50. I think it's fewer than 60. That may be wrong. But they do include masterpieces of modern historical fiction, not least the Sharp series about King Arthur, series about the 100 Years' War, and of course, what's in the age of Netflix known as the Last Kingdom series, the Uhtred novels. We're discussing the 13th and final Last Kingdom novel this evening. Hello, Bernard Cornwell.
And hello, Dan. It's very nice to speak to you again, even in this rather strange fashion. And hello to everybody who's watching.
I'm insanely jealous, I think is the only way to describe it, of your library. Is that where you write?
This is where I write, yes. It's a sort of barn built back of the house.
It's absolutely beautiful, I've got to say. Are you writing at the moment, or have you got time off just to talk about things you have written?
Well, I am writing at the moment, but I certainly got time off to talk to you, Dan.
Oh, you're such a charmer. Let's get the lockdown stuff out of the way first of all. I mean, how has life changed or not changed for you as a writer when you've been stuck indoors?
Well, it really hasn't changed that much, and I'm sure you know this. I mean, we both have a job that is mostly a solitary vice. You know, I come to this room and I write, and I've been doing that ever since the lockdown started. And what I miss is seeing friends. But other than that, life is pretty normal.
So you haven't found that there's, do you get inspiration from the wider world, or is it all contained in the books that are behind you?
It's all contained in the books behind me and up here. I'm sure it is for most writers. I rather like the solitary writer bit.
Let's talk about Warlord, which is the last Kingdom book. Why have you decided to bring the curtain down on this series? Is it just a history that's brought you to the end, or are you fed up with it, or why is it ending?
Yeah, I think we've reached the crucial point. I mean, most historical novels have a big story and a little story. If you look at Gone with the Wind, the big story is the Civil War. The little story is, can Scarlet save Tara? And the trick of it is to flip them. You put the little story in the foreground and the big story in the background. And the big story of The Last Kingdom, or the Uhtred books, is the making of England. And in the 13th book, we really make it. On the morning of the Battle of Brunanburg, there wasn't an England, and it's not too much of a stretch to say that by the time the battle ended, there was. So, you know, that story, the big story has come to an end, so the little story has to end with it.
When you first conceived of this particular series of books, did you have that sort of grand arc in your head? And how structural are you as a writer? Did you say, okay, I've got an idea for a 13-part series, and it's gonna start in the Pembroke Castle, and it's going to end up with this battle, or does it just unwind as well?
It unwinds. I wish I could plan a book, but I can't. I mean, I'm terribly envious of those writers who plan the whole book ahead, let alone the whole series ahead. I think it was the great E.L. Doctorow who said that writing a book is rather like driving down an unfamiliar country lane at night, and you can only see as far ahead as your rather weak headlights show. And I think for me, that's true. I mean, I've actually reached the last chapter of a book and not known how it's going to end. But for me, the joy of writing is finding out what happens, just as it is the joy of reading a book. But I did know, I mean, that said, I did know that the Battle of Brunanburg was going to be, if you like, the grand full stop on the series.
And of course, you had a sense not only of this as the history of England, but there's also a family connection here, isn't there? If you wouldn't mind telling a story, I know that you've told once or twice before, but how you came to conceive of this particular series in this particular age?
Well, we go back to, the big story and little story. And I always wanted to tell the big story of the making of England because the Saxon period fascinated me for a long time. But I didn't have any idea of a little story. And then when I was in my 50s, which is very late, I met my real father for the first time. And his surname was Uhtred, Ughted. And on our second or third meeting, he showed me a family tree. And the family tree went all the way back to Odin, the god. So I am descended from gods. And I thought, wow, that's my little story, because I have a character. I have an ancestor called Uhtred, which is not far removed from Uhtred. And they held on to their fortress in Northumbria throughout the Viking occupation of northern England. So how did they do that? Why did they do that? And what effect did it have on the big story? So that really was the start of it, when I discovered that I was actually descended from a man who eventually I made into my hero.
And is that part of the world? I mean, I've visited Bamburgh Castle and that particular stretch of the northeast of England many times, and it's one of my favourite parts of England. And even going past it on the train between London and Scotland, it's that part of England has a real fascination for me. It's a part of England you knew well.
I didn't know it at all. And strangely, my wife and I went on vacation there. I can't even remember when. It was before I met my father. And we rented a house very close to Bamburgh. And we loved it. We absolutely loved the area and liked it so much that the next year we went back and rented another house in the same place. And then 2 years later, I discovered that my family had once owned that fortress. So I don't know whether there's anything supernatural going on there. But my first visit to Northumbria I just fell in love with it instantly.
And is that typical for the way that you've been inspired to write your novels over the years? I mean, does it take a sort of a chance encounter or a personal revelation? Where is this, or is there no typical way of ideas coming to you?
I don't think there's a typical way. I mean, with Sharp, it was obviously a spin-off, or certainly a copycat of Hornblower. It just struck me that there were all these guys writing novels about the naval war against Napoleon, and nobody had done the same for the army, which seemed to me rather weird. But for the others, I don't know. I really don't know where they come from. I mean, usually when I'm writing one book, I'm thinking about the next, and all your question tells me is I haven't thought about what I'm going to write after the one I'm writing now. So I'm getting a bit worried here.
Well, in that case, let's stick in the late 9th century, which is, of course, the world that we're talking about, when England is just forming, when we have sort of great famous names like King Alfred, as is in the beginning of this series, and where, of course, your sort of your ancestor in fictional form is charging around, causing quite a lot of trouble. What is it about the 9th century that makes it such an intriguing time to write about, do you think?
Well, I think it is because of the big story, because this is the creation of England. I mean, I was always struck by the fact that I thought I had a reasonably good historical education in England, in schools. But nobody ever told me where England came from or how it happened. I mean, there was this assumption there's always been an England, there always will be. Well, there wasn't always an England. Anyways, it's a dream that starts with King Alfred. And although he doesn't live to see it completed, his grandson does complete the dream for him. So for me, the fascination is simply this enormous historical period in which what we think of as the United Kingdom took its present form. I mean, much the same thing was going on in Wales under Hywel Dda, and much the same thing in Scotland under Constantine, all at the same time. They're making today's modern political map. And I think that's the story worth telling.
And when you came to start writing this series, then, I mean, you said that this hadn't been something you'd learned as a matter of course in school. It certainly wasn't something I learned as a matter of course in school either, and I suspect my children don't. But did you have a sort of working knowledge of this period already? Had you read around it, or did you have to then sort of go and do the dive into the history?
Oh, I had a sort of rough working knowledge. And I knew a lot of the Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is very inspirational. But as usual, there was a lot of research to do, a huge amount. So yes, I spent the last 15 years reading about the Saxons, traveling around England, looking at places. I don't think the research ever ends.
But you are a heavy, the research well, yes, clearly within all of these novels there is a depth of knowledge, but I mean an easy depth of knowledge in your books, and it seems to me, and tell me if this is, I've got this wildly wrong, that you've immersed yourself in this period to the point where you're not kind of hammering home the little details. They're just there, and if you reach for the way that somebody gets on a horse or has a fight or uses a weapon, you just have this sort of sense of the world.
Well, I hope so. I mean, that's what you aim for. I mean, essentially, you simply have to make that background authentic. It doesn't have to be accurate. It has to be authentic. And very often the most difficult things, as I'm sure you know, doing research is not finding out about the big events. It's finding about how people live. And that often was quite difficult. But a lot of it is assumption, of course. And the more you know about the period, the more the imagination fills in those gaps.
What are are you drawn to a particular genre is the wrong word, but discipline, I suppose, might be the right one. I mean, when you're doing your research, are you more drawn to? You've mentioned poetry already, but there's poetry, history, or archaeology. I mean, do you lean in one direction or the other?
No, they're all wonderful and all useful. And the archaeology is not usually quite as accessible as the rest. But, on Warlord, I was very lucky to meet the archaeologists who were working on the Wirral, where the battle was fought. And I learned a lot from them.
Yeah, well, tell us a bit more about this, because in this decisive battle, the Battle of Brunanburh, the location of the battle has, until last year, I think, been something of a mystery, hasn't it? But now, if you put into Google Battle of Brunanburh, it often comes up with historical novelist Bernard Cornwell has revealed that the location of this great battle is in the Wirral. I mean, you were clearly quite involved in the project.
I wasn't involved in the project at all, really. I'm in a splendid group of people called Wirral Archaeology. They did the work, and they have, I think, I'm 99% sure they have found the battlefield. And they were kind enough to invite me to go and visit them, which I did. And I saw a lot of the stuff that they've found, mostly broken weaponry. And they found grave pits. And I think I'm sure they made the announcement. It wasn't up to me to make it, but I did sort of follow in their footsteps and say, yes, we found it. And curiously, it has been lost for hundreds of years. And it's very strange because this was a major battle. I mean, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it says, never was there such slaughter in this island. And for hundreds of years afterwards, every chronicle or annal in Europe calls it the Great Battle. And then we completely forgot where it was fought. And over the years, there have been many, many, many suggestions, ranging from Solway Firth to County Durham. There's one, for a long time, people thought it was fought off a lay-by on the A1 in Yorkshire. But it wasn't. I'm absolutely certain this was fought on the Wirral. And that makes total sense, because the leader of the army that fought against the Saxons came from Dublin. And the Chronicle records that he brought ships across. Well, if you're going to bring ships, you're going to take the shortest route. And the shortest route will land you up on England's west coast, not on the east coast. So I'm sure we found the place where the Battle of Brunanburh was fought. And I hope that one day there'll be a visitor center there so people can actually find out for themselves what happened.
Do you find that there's an added pressure, or indeed any pressure, when you're fictionalizing a battle like that, which does mean a lot to archaeologists working on a project to find its location, but also has great importance in England and Britain's national history. When you're writing a book like this, do you feel any weight of responsibility to, quote unquote, get it right? And we can talk about what get it right means in a minute.
Talk about that forever. We don't know what happened. I mean, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle says that Athelstan, who was the king of the that Athelstan broke the enemy's shield wall and then pursued them. Obviously, the enemy army that was mostly Scots and Irish Vikings. They got broken, they panicked, and they fled, and they were pursued. So we know something about the battle, and we now think we know where it was fought, but we're never going to know the real details. And there's an awful lot of legend built into it. I mean, apparently King Athelstan's sword broke, and Bishop Odo somehow conjured a new one for him, which was thought to be a miracle. So, you know, out of that mess of myth and a few facts, we have to try and put together a coherent narrative that, even if it's not accurate, is at least authentic and convincing, which is what I tried to do. And it did help, having walked that field.
And well, let's not talk forever about it, but let's talk about this idea of what getting it right means in historical fiction. Now, we could be philosophical and say that all history, you know, it would be 1990s postmodernists, 1980s postmodernists here, and say, well, look, all history is essentially fictionalized in any case. All narrative is false. You may as well be writing a sort of a, you know, historical book as a work of historical fiction. I sincerely hope that's not the case, and there is something that we can call objective reality. Nevertheless, what does for you in writing historical fiction, what does getting it right mean? What is being authentic to the period? Just drill down into that a little bit.
Well, it depends so much on what you're writing. I mean, I've written a couple of books about the American Revolution, and in both those cases, we've got a wealth of material. I mean, diaries, letters, newspaper reports. You can't obviously lie in the face of all that evidence and just make it up. So you are constrained by what is, if you like, recorded history. But on the other hand, if you're writing about the Battle of Brunanburg in the early 10th century, the recorded history is so scant as to be non-existent. I mean, none of the people who fought there left a record of what happened. And the Chronicle broke into poetry to record it. So in some ways, it's easier when you're dealing with the 10th century or the 9th century, because you obviously can make a lot of it up. You have to make a lot of it up. But you can't do that if you're writing about the Battle of Salamanca or, God help you, the Battle of Waterloo. There is so much material. And you have to get that right. And I do sometimes play merry hell with the history, even when it's recorded like that. But I try to confess it in the historical note and say, look, this didn't happen, which I think is all you can do. But essentially, going back to my thing about the big story and the little story, the big story has to be right. But the little story is all fiction, or almost all fiction. I mean, it's very nice when the little story can affect the big story, but that's pretty rare.
Do you have a preference between writing about some time like the 9th century, when you have a lot of latitude to make up the big story as well as the little story, or at least to speculate on the big story as well as the little story? Do you prefer writing that to writing, sharp, when you're in a time where there just are more records, there is more evidence?
I always prefer writing whatever I'm writing at the moment. I mean, I'm not saying they're both pleasurable. I mean, writing sharp, I know Sharp's background. I know that big story so well that it's a pleasure just to be back in that scenario. In some ways, it's more difficult to write when, in fact, there's very little in the contemporary record. And I wrote a book about the creation of Stonehenge, where there's absolutely nothing. And that was incredibly frustrating, because in the end, you have to make up a whole theology for these people, which I'm not sure I succeeded in doing.
Do you find that people turn to your books for historical information about the past?
I did once get a very nice letter from an army officer who said he passed his exams at Sandhurst through reading Sharp. So I'm delighted if that happened. I think historical novels are gateways to history. I mean, when I was a teenager, I read all the Hornblower novels and absolutely loved them. And there were only 11. And when I'd read the last one, the only thing left to do was to go to the school library and get the books on the Napoleonic War. So Hornblower led me directly into the Napoleonic Wars. And that's a valuable thing for an historical novel to do. I mean, I'd love to think that people reading Warlord or The Last Kingdom want to find out more about the Saxons, if only to find out what I've got wrong. I mean, they're welcome. I don't think it does any harm for us to know more about these periods or to know more about our history.
Do you ever get dissatisfied customers? I mean, I'm sure you get dissatisfied, but maybe one or two over the years. Do you have people coming along and pointing out what you've got wrong? And so is that
there's always a helpful reader, and usually, damn them, they're right. I mean, when I wrote the 3 books about Arthur, I mean, I had a very indignant letter saying there were no snowdrops in England in the 7th century. Well, I didn't know that, mentioned, but good to have that learned, right? And other times, I mean, again, I think it was in one of the Sharp books, I had a saw-backed bayonet, and I got this wonderful letter from a man who said that he was probably England's greatest expert on bayonets and had never heard of such a thing, and what was my source. So I confessed I made it up. But that turned into a friendship. So that was nice. Oh yeah, there's always a helpful reader. I mean, I've long thought that I could write a book in which I said that the French won Waterloo and I would get no letters at all. But if I wrote that the 43rd Regiment had 3 buttons on their sleeve, I would get thousands of letters saying, "You fool, everyone knows there were 4." Odd enough, the most interesting letters always came after I wrote the Arthurian books. And they all started in much the same way. "Dear Mr. Cornwell, I have just read your book, The Winter King, and you have it all wrong. I was Lancelot in a previous existence." And I have a whole file, it's a very thick file, of letters from people who had a previous existence in the Arthurian time. And there's nothing you can do about that, I mean, except to write and apologize for having got their life history wrong.
It's very strange that you say that, because I've never heard before now of Lancelot being one of the sort of the people who respawns an awful lot in the modern age. I mean, one tends to get Anne Boleyn, Marie Antoinette, a little bit of Richard III. I wonder what it is about these particular historical characters that they keep coming back, or that people feel this deep connection with them over the past. What is it about Lancelot?
I don't know. I mean, maybe I can't remember it. I might have made that up. I mean, I certainly had Gawain and others, and I had 17 ladies who'd been Guinevere. And I did actually write back to some of them and say, "Well, tell me what happened." And they tend not to know is the answer. Although I did have one who wanted me to go and sleep in a cave. And he said, "The dreams will come and will tell you." And it is much to my shame that I never took him up on that. But as a form of historical research, going to sleep with a stranger in a cave in Wales might have been valuable. Don't know.
Well, that's very exciting. I mean, you're very good at engaging with your readers, though. I mean, on your website, you regularly post readers' questions with your answers. I'm slightly addicted to that section of your website. And Nick Cave, the musician, I believe, does a lot of this. He has a more sort of holistic self-help approach to his answering his fans' questions. But in an age as a writer where it's very, very easy for fans to send you with letters claiming that they're Gawain or Guinevere, or queries about the points of your books, how important is it to you to interact with your fans, and how do you carve out your time? Because presumably you could spend all day answering questions about Sharp and about Uhtred and so on.
Well, yes, and I try to spend, this sounds churlish, as little time as possible doing that, because it does take time away from the more important thing of writing the books. But it is important. I mean, if they take the trouble to write to me, they do deserve an answer. I mean, some of them infuriate me. I get a lot of kids around the sort of 5th form and 6th form who've got a project at school, basically ask me to write it for them, which I don't do. But I can understand the question. And the other one, which is very, very, I don't know, it's not infuriating, is I had a great-great-great-grandfather who served at Waterloo. What can you tell me about him? Well, the answer is nothing. I mean, unless you're lucky and happen to have a really famous one, but I haven't had any of those. But most of them are really very nice questions, and they're nice people. The other frustrating thing is I often get questioned, why did you do such and such to such and such a character in a book that I wrote 15, 20 years ago? And I can't even remember the character, let alone remember the book. And all you can do is write honestly back and say, look, I wrote it so long ago, I have no idea. Which is, I think, frustrating for them, as it's frustrating for me. But they're nice people. I mean, I do enjoy meeting. If you do a book tour and you go to bookshops and you meet the readers, and they also have really good ideas. And it's valuable. Can't do it now.
How have you found? You've had a wonderfully long career. I should actually ask you, do you know how many books you've written? Because I knew it was somewhere in the 50s, or I had a feeling it was somewhere in the 50s. Lost count.
It's high 50s, 57 or 58, I think. But I'm not sure.
And how, over the course of writing those 50 books, how have you found the world has changed as an author? Because presumably in several decades, it's changed profoundly. I mean, we've touched on it in talking about how to interact with fans, but what else has changed?
Well, I suppose it's the ebook is the biggest change. That people are buying books and putting them onto iPads or Kindles. And that too has a strange knock-on effect, because I got a very indignant letter about 3 years ago from someone saying, your new book is dreadful, absolutely awful. I've loved all your books, but this book is absolutely appalling. Why do you have such sex in the book? And I thought, well, that's very odd, because I never really do that. And so I asked him what book he was reading, and it turned out to be by somebody else. And of course, when you're reading a book on a Kindle or an iPad, you never see the cover. All you see is where you stopped reading last time. So you actually don't know what book you're reading. And I do read on an iPad, but I'm very aware of the fact that I'm often no idea who this author is that I'm enjoying. But other than that, I mean, publishing is still the same business, Dan, as you know. But I mean, it's these dear people who try and sell books to wonderful readers. It's just a
has the research part of the job changed? Because I mean, has the research part of the job changed? Because I've certainly found writing history books that it's necessitated far fewer trips to big research libraries than it used to, partly because of archive.org and the mass digitization of all those books of records and calendars of files that were put together by the Victorians, which are now out of copyright and Google and various other big American universities have digitized. Have you found the research process has changed or gotten easier?
I mean, I noticed when I was writing Uhtred, although I had a copy of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, it was so much easier just to go to a digitized copy online. But I'm a little bit wary of the internet. And somebody once said that if you had 1 million monkeys with 1 million typewriters, they'd end up writing Shakespeare's sonnets. Well, they didn't. They ended up writing the internet. And there's a lot of terrible information. But also, I tell you something which I found. The book I'm writing at the moment had a scene set in a fortress in France. And I had not visited this fortress, and I doubt I'll be able to because of the pandemic. But going on to Google Maps or Google Earth, you could actually measure the fortress exactly. I needed to know the size of the courtyard inside, and I got it exactly. It was 293.3 meters long and 98 point something wide. And then you can also go to Google Images and look at that landscape. It's extraordinary. I found it more useful in that way, to actually look at a place than it may be only a minor place in a book and probably doesn't deserve a visit, or I don't have the time to visit. But you can tell an enormous amount from the pictures, from Google Earth or from Google Maps, going to the little man who walks around roads. So the internet has its uses, but it's still mostly book driven. You know, I go to
How
people
would
like
you
who rip them off.
how would you how do you think Uhtred would cope if you dropped him into the 21st century? Let's talk a little bit about his character and this really quite what's the right word for him? He's not your all-round, easily likable, totally benevolent, classic hero, is he? This is a hero who's got real sharp edges to him. How would he cope in the 21st century? And then let's talk a little bit more about his character.
Well, I imagine he'd get bail, but I mean, this is very much an alpha male community. I mean, the story of the creation of England is a story of almost continual warfare. And King Alfred, who was not, I'm convinced, a warlike man. I mean, he was a scholar, and he was also very sick for his whole life. It's not, that doesn't add up to a picture of the sort of male-clad warrior. But he knew he needed warriors. He knew he needed people who would fight, and fight viciously. It was a horrible, horrible period. I mean, most of the battles are fought at arm's length or closer. And to do that, you need a peculiar kind of person who enjoys that activity. And Uhtred is one of those. I mean, he's a warrior in a warrior culture. So I suppose that's where he begins in my head, that he's a warrior in a warrior culture.
And is his Danish, Scandinavian heritage an important part of building that aspect of his character? And by heritage, of course, I mean, his education, his cultural.
Yes, I mean, it confuses him, and it gives him a certain amount of tension with, I mean, in many ways, for me, the most important character in the books was not Uhtred, it was Alfred, who was this extraordinarily clever man with an ambition, if you like, a dream, and the dream was a united country. But he's a man who Uhtred really cannot get along with. I mean, they are divided by all sorts of sympathies, including religious ones. And I just think that's always interesting, that it makes my life more interesting to write about a man who is at loggerheads with perhaps the greatest character of the period. And Uhtred, for all sorts of reasons, turns out to be a pagan. And he's a pagan working inside a Christian framework, which means he needs to have those sharp edges. I get a lot of letters from very kindly priests who tell me where Uhtred is wrong.
But how difficult is it when you're building a character like that, who is prone? I mean, I'm thinking early on in, I think, the second book in the series, The Pale Horseman, where he gets annoyed that someone's cut a tree down, the steward, quite early, and just kills him. I mean, it's quite shocking, and quite early on,
He wasn't annoyed that the tree was cut down. He was annoyed that he was being robbed. He was annoyed that that steward was selling timber from his land without permission. Yeah, and yeah, it's a bit extreme.
But I mean, it's wonderful in the sense because it occurs so early in the book that you're suddenly jolted upright and you're reminded of just how well impulsive in one sense, but also sort of strictly moral this character is. Is it difficult when you're writing a character like that to make sure that or how do you balance the character so you keep sympathy on the reader's part when he does things like that?
I don't, to be honest. I mean, the characters emerge the same way the stories do. And I mean, when you invent a new character like Uhtred, part of the joy of writing him is to discover who he is and what he does. But again, I never begin with a template and say, well, I'll make this man or this woman into this, this, and this. And very often the characters in my book surprise me. They do things I don't want them to do or don't expect them to do. And usually it's best to let them do it. It means that they know what they're doing, so let them do it. I never thought about Uhtred in the sense of, well, what sort of a man is he? He emerged. And I think that's probably the best way.
So you never set out even with a sort of a basic biographical template. It's just here is a short sort of entry and let's let him loose.
Yeah, I mean, I usually find the best way to open a book is to simply put the hero into some situation and see how he gets out, and then hope that that spins off into a story. And I think they almost all begin that way.
How do you think he's developed over the course of these 13 books? I mean, how has he changed in terms of your relationship with him, if you see what
I mean? I suppose he's become more cynical. He's seen too much. I mean, we all do, don't we? I mean, as we get older and we look at those who rule over us, and you know, when you're young, you think these people must be wise. Now we realize they're a pack of idiots because we've learned. I don't know. I mean, I've lived with Uhtred for 15, 16 years. I mean, the wretched man inhabited my head for a long time. And again, I didn't think about it. You know, if I sat down to write a new Uhtred book, it really was just that. Okay, here we go again. What are we going to do together? And he's alive in my head, but again, I haven't given him a great deal of thought. So I guess I can't answer your question, Dan.
Well, probably a very good question in that case, or a very bad one. How did you feel finishing him off, if you like? You know, finishing this series. Was there a kind of was it J.K. Rowling? You know, did you burst into tears at the end of the last book, or what does it feel like to leave somebody behind like that?
Well, I haven't really left him behind. I mean, he's still there. I don't think I'll write another one, but I'm sure I could if I really wanted to. I mean, there was a certain sadness and a certain relief that, you know, I'm no longer back in that world. And when you write a book, that book haunts you while you're writing it. I mean, it's what you think about when you wake up in the morning is when, you know, when you're walking the dog, suddenly there's Uhtred in your head talking. And that's all gone. It's just vanished. But I don't think he'll ever be gone entirely from me because I spent too much time with him.
Do you go back and read the previous books before you sit down to write one, or even at any point, you pick up a Bernard Cornwell yourself? And
I never do. No, I mean, I'd be terrified to do that. But what I do is that all the Uhtred books, the whole series, are in one giant file on my computer. And so when I have a character and I think, oh, I know he's been in previous books, I use the find thing and see what I've said about him. So you'll sort of zip through, I think it's 3 million words, and find out what you said about him or her. And that's useful. But that's as much as I do. I never wanted to reread one of my own books.
You think you ever will?
Maybe when I'm really old. I'm only nearly old at the moment. Yeah, maybe it'll be interesting one day. But I mean, I remember once that my wife put one of my books on an audio tape into the car, and we began listening to it, and I had to stop it. I mean, I couldn't believe I'd written a sentence that bad, and so I just said, "Take it out now."
And what kind of a writer are you when you're actually at work? Are you a splurge it out and edit it later? Are you write clean on a first draft? Do you edit day by day as you go? Tell me a little bit about your process, because I always find this very interesting with authors. And mostly they're weird. I mean, I'm sure you'll be the exception. But what is your writing process like?
Well, it's a splurge, really. I mean, the thing is just to sit there all day and get the damn thing down. And what is most frustrating is that you normally get about a third or a halfway through the book before you discover what this damn book is about. And that means you have to go back to the beginning. I always think of it's rather like climbing a mountain. You get a third of the way up and you look back and you see a better route. So you go back and you take that route, and that propels you halfway up. And then you turn around and look back, and again it goes on. So the book gets written 3 or 4 times, probably, except for the ending, which is lucky if it gets 2 revisions. But it's not a very efficient way of doing it, but it's the only way I know how, again, because I simply cannot plan it out. And the only way to discover the story is to write it.
Yeah.
I remember the writer James Hall said to me once that every book is a journey that has never been taken before. How on earth can you map it out? You can't. You have to explore it. That's always a nice moment.
Do you read? I mean, you mentioned Hornblower earlier on as something you were reading when you were young. Who were the big influences on you apart from Hornblower? And do you still read historical fiction today, or is that?
I do. I find it difficult to read most historical fiction because I spend all day writing it, and suddenly. But I mean, Hilary Mantel is a goddess, and I just finished reading Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, which I think is a work of genius. And I don't feel in that way that I am reading something that I could write. It's far beyond my capability to write. And so that's the pleasure. So yes, I do. I read historical novels, but they tend to be novels that I wouldn't or couldn't write.
And what about your influences before you started writing? I mean, who were the big influences on you? And were you ever thinking, okay, I want to do it like X or like X plus what? Where did it come from?
Well, I think I wanted to do it like Forrester, and I doubt I've succeeded. He's so brilliant. But I mean, originally, going way back 40 years, the thought was, well, there have been so many series about the Napoleonic Wars set at sea. There's Hornblower, there's Ramage, there's Belitha, and then of course there was Patrick O'Brien coming along. That there surely must be a market for the same thing with the army. So it was very much copycat, based on the success of Hornblower and of the others. And then after, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I thought, well, actually, I'm now, whether I like it or not, I'm an historical novelist. We better keep going on this. And so it's going on. So it's gone on.
What about the television? I mentioned at the beginning that this is now The Last Kingdom. Well, of course, that's the name of the book, but it's the name that's been bestowed upon the whole series, effectively, I suppose, by television, by Netflix. So, how do you interact with the television adaptations of your books?
I enjoy them, and that's as far as it goes. I'm not involved. Carnival Films, who make them, very, very kindly invited me to go to Hungary where they shoot them. This was a couple of years ago. and gave me a cameo appearance where I was murdered by my own hero. And that was fun. I mean, it was great fun to be there and to see these guys walking around in their costumes. But that's it. I mean, I don't want to be involved. I don't want to be a technical advisor. I know nothing about making TV drama, and they know everything. But I do enjoy them, and I like Alexander Draymond's portrayal of the younger Uhtred. So I'm just a viewer. Period.
Are they? I presume the answer to this is yes, although I don't know for sure. How important or not important have they been to the novel's success or their journey? I mean, how I was this time last year I was talking to George R.R. Martin, who of course was extremely successful in a number of careers before he became the George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones. But clearly, in his case, the television had become a huge part of the writing process, as well as making the books massively better known than they had been before. How has it affected your standing or your reputation or your fame, I suppose?
I have no idea. You'd have to ask somebody else, though. I mean, obviously, it's helped, but I really don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I sit here in this room and write, and I'm not involved in that other side. But I mean, the Sharp series helped enormously. I mean, the only influence that had is that whenever I think about Sharp, I hear Sean Bean's voice, and he was such a perfect actor to do. Yeah, I can hear his voice in my head plainly. I mean, it's a wonderful thing to happen to any author. I mean, television is an incredibly powerful thing, as you know. I regard it as added value. I mean, when you look at one of the Uhtred stories in The Last Kingdom, it may not follow the book exactly, because it probably can't, because they have constraints I don't have. But you get all the added talent of the actors, of the costume people, of the makeup people, of the producers, the directors. They all add their own contribution to it. So it's added value. And when people write to me and say, oh, I didn't like it because they changed your story, I think, well, you're getting another story for free. Stop bitching. Enjoy it.
Well, that was what I was going to ask you. Do people assume that there is a sort of a creative ownership of the television by you?
They blame me when it's different from the book. And, well, maybe it's better than the book. And, just sit back and enjoy it.
I've got to say, Bernard, you are a remarkably laid-back character for a writer. And I'm never sure whether it's highly strong people who are attracted to the business of writing, or whether the experience of being alone in a room all the time makes most writers highly strong. You clearly have a sort of a great calm to you. Is this? Can this really be the case, or are you sort of frantic when you're not doing interviews to promote your books?
Irish whiskey and good tobacco. It's all I can offer as an explanation there.
I remember reading an interview with Lee Child a while ago, where I think he swore by were there 3 C's or 4? There was certainly champagne, cigarettes, coffee, and there may have been cannabis as well. And these were the ingredients that went into sending Jack Reacher off on his great adventures. And so maybe maybe the Cornwell and Child approach. I mean, empirically, it seems evidence would suggest it works.
Well, yeah, I always think of Irish whiskey as writer fuel, so maybe it is.
Can you? I mean, sort of semi-serious question. Can you write after you've drunk several glasses of Irish whiskey? I find I'm very much a sober writer. I convince myself I'm good when I'm in the evening, but I'm really not.
I've never been convinced by writer's block, except that alcohol causes it. I mean, if I even have a glass of wine at lunchtime, that's probably the afternoon is gone. So like you, I'm a sober writer, but come 6 o'clock at night, no.
And what do you do to when you're not writing? I mean, I've a funny feeling you're a keen actor. Am I right?
Well, I was. I spent 10 years on stage in the summer stock theatre in Massachusetts here. But sadly, they sold the theatre out from underneath us. And so we got evicted, and which has been rather sad because it's sitting there empty and decaying. But I've been sailing a lot this summer, which is another nice thing to do if you live on Cape Cod, as I do. But I miss the theatre.
I'm sure. I mean, how are you going to get back into it?
Well, I'm not sure that I am. I think that career is over, and, which is really a pity. And it was an extraordinary place because it was a theatre that gathered together a group of, I call them kids, which is not really right, drama students from across North America and sometimes from Britain too. And they were all training to be theatre professionals. And they would put on 8 plays through the summer. And the directors were always professionals, equity professionals from New York and from London. And I somehow got involved. It was an extraordinary decade of doing something I'd never done before and didn't know I could do it or anything else. And it meant that for 3 months every summer, I was in the company of these extraordinary young people who were very clever, very enthusiastic, and very irreverent, doing something that was the very opposite of what I normally do, which is being solitary in this room and writing. You know, you're involving in a group of people. So I miss it immensely. But the only good thing that came out of that was the book Fools and Mortals, which was a tribute to the theatre. Because I was in so many of Shakespeare's plays, I got more and more interested in Shakespeare and how he actually did produce, how his plays were first staged. So that was one good thing that came out of it, and a lot of happy memories.
Yes, that must have been a very enjoyable. Is detour the right word? I hope I'm not betraying your editor's confidence when I say that she came round for tea to my house one day and said, Bernard's next book is about the stage and no one gets brutally killed. And I said, gosh, that's how do HarperFictionPresents feel about that? Was that refreshing? I mean, do you plan to write more about that kind of world?
No, I don't think so. I mean, there's the I don't know what I'm going to write in the future. I mean, I'm writing now, but beyond this book, I don't know. And normally I do, which probably means that an idea will come within the next, I hope, couple of months. And then while I'm writing one book, I'm very much thinking and researching the next.
And then you mentioned you are writing another one at the moment. Can you tell us what you're writing?
I've gone back to Sharp. I always thought I would. There's a couple of gaps in his career, which I always tease myself that I would save them for my retirement. So I'm doing a Sharp, and it was very interesting because, I mean, the moment that I opened up the blank page on the first day, Sharp came straight back into my head, talking like Sean Bean and being grumpy. So I'm enjoying it.
That's amazing. And after that, you're not sure?
I have no idea. No idea. The big problem would be to find a title for the book. Titles are always difficult.
Who came up with?
I mean, I tend my. Oh, that was the editor who had tea with you. She thought of that, and she thought of Fools and Mortals. And they never liked my title. They always. The biggest fights with the publisher is always over the title.
What was your title for Warlord?
I can't remember now, to be honest. I really can't remember. I don't remember at all. The Last Kingdom was my title, though.
Well, there we go. That was the big one. I think you claim credit for that, and everything else is whatever.
Always Sharp's something. Sharp's Eagle, Sharp's Regiment, Sharp's Battle, Sharp's Waterloo. I wanted to call one of the Indian adventures Sharp's Curry, but they wouldn't allow me. So I have no idea what this one will be. I've used up most of them, so I have to find something else.
Well, I've got one last question for you, Bernard, because I told some of my Facebook followers, many of whom are very keen readers of your books, that I was going to be talking to you, and they submitted some very intellectual questions to ask you. And my favourite of them is very simply, what do you prefer writing with, a pen or a computer?
A computer. Totally. I love them. I'm very fortunate. I have the most enormous screen, so like a 40-odd inch television set, and you can have 2 full pages up on, and larger than life, which makes rewriting so much easier. And I mean, I so rarely write with a pen these days, and my handwriting is appalling. Not as bad as my wife's, that looks like a drunken spider has just crawled across a page, but I don't think anybody could read my handwriting. And I can't imagine writing a book.
Well, yes, I mean, so you could never be the James Elroy writing longhand on legal pads and sending it off to somebody else to decipher and type up.
Or like the wonderful Mary Wesley, who did the same thing and wrote them all in longhand. And I can't even imagine it. I mean, the first books were written on typewriters, and I remember that, but I wouldn't want to go back. I don't think I've even got a typewriter any longer. But no, I love the computer.
Well, I love the computer as well because, and this is a really good segue that I'm very proud of, it's given us this chance to sit here I'm going to do it in our 2 libraries on 2 separate continents in the middle of the pandemic, discussing your brilliant new novel, Warlord. I'm getting messages on my screen saying, well, effectively, shut up. So with that in mind, and also I think my wife. Yes, here she is. So on that note, we are live. Go away. This is now a longer intro than I intended. On that note, Bernard, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, to have this insight into not only the wonderful novel that you've written, the wonderful series that you've written, but also the life of a writer, which I think is totally unique from person to person, but yours more unique maybe than anyone else's. Bernard, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much for taking the time. And of course, thank you everybody else for tuning in to this Fane online event. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you, Dan. Stay safe.
And you.